regard to culture is but one mechanism and means to begin answering that question of organization. It is also another mechanism to start asking how solidarity is established among those organized and the manners in which ontological orientations or their modes of existence are transmitted intergenerationally. That is, studying the relationship between language and culture as it is situated within time and space can reveal how political statuses, cultural customs, and traditions are expressed both within groups and to others. For example, studying what we are doing here can provide tremendous insights into how culture is perceived, transmitted, and how these modes of existence are expressed to advance placemaking as a cultural and economic strategy to interface with our ever-evolving world. And it is here that, expanding our perceptions of how language and culture can play off of one another, we can trace these paradigm shifts by the means through which we ourselves shift meanings and then enact those objectives into the world. And part of the beauty inherent in learning about solidarity and these measures is that the transmission of lifeways must proceed together. And as such, there are many ways to achieve the cohesion and expand interfaces with our heritage, and dialogue is a highly effective strategy therein. So when we come to the understanding that the relationship between language and culture signals a larger paradigm of creative potential and world-building processes, we can begin to add both breadth and depth to how we exist in the world in accordance with the specific time and space we find ourselves in. Moreover, when the relationship between language and culture is practiced through a balanced approach, levels of primary meaning production come into play. Thus, with deliberate action, an individual in concert with those in solidarity can quite effectively establish levels of significance for those who may only have access to world-building initiatives through literature or the media, for example. So when I listen to Chief Tupac talk about shifting the ways our story is told and sold, my mind cues a specific chronotopic or communicative paradigm. It cues one of innovation, unabating and deliberate work in the pursuit to speak a world into existence that reflects an honor for the sacred while interfacing with the evolution of technological and societal structures. This is the point in which I think additional and deliberate action through a community-oriented lens can be of service. For example, if we perceive shortcomings among educational systems or marginalization from engaging in the world stage, we can develop in solidarity as a community and arrange the necessary tools and pathways to integrate with the world stage in our own individual ways. Here, I will venture to propose that the Linguistic, Cultural, and Legal Leadership Program is but one mechanism to promote these activities. Community development initiatives are contextual endeavors that must reflect specific cultural values. This tentative framework I will be describing reflects initiatives that seek to bridge the intersections between language, culture, and mobility. Here, here's a proposal for the development of the Linguistic, Cultural, and Legal Leadership Program called the LCLLP, a proposed 5-week summer program that supports the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas and their member nations initiatives. And seeing that FANA's mission to, quote, provide leadership and serve as the collective voice for the development of the mass unation of the Aboriginal tribes and nations of the Americas, a central element to serve as a collective voice requires a focused and deliberate dialogue to expand mass unification of these tribes and nations through sustainable development. And upholding this central element, the key features involved in this program promote linguistic revitalization, culture-based education, and legal education to advance FANA's sustainable self-determination, social cohesion, and community. In our ever-globalizing world, social resilience is a mainstay for groups seeking to engage our world in more connected ways. And striking a balance here between one's cultural expression interfaces with our diverse world requires social cohesion paired with the deliberate performance of language. Yet it is argued that there is little research conducted on the possible connections between community resilience and different forms of human and environmental capital, for example. Human capital refers to the knowledge, skills, and understanding that an individual or group maintains, while environmental capital refers to the benefits an ecosystem can yield. This program has the potential to initiate a practical example that demonstrates the interconnection between community resilience, human capital, and environmental capital. The relationship between language and society is highly important when navigating and teaching people about our world. And as a side, it is also worth noting that therein, sociolinguistic concepts account for various levels of language in society and can be very influential and leveraged, consciously applied to an educational environment, as they can facilitate a productive medium for conveying the central objective of this program, which is to advance fairness, strength through unity. In this way, the mission of the program is to empower the FANA community through linguistic and culturally based knowledge systems with legal sense. Interweaving these meaning-making approaches into the fabric of this program is but one facet to ensure that both a strategic and effective transmission of information takes place. In doing so, teach those participating the importance of the interplay between language and culture. Still, loosely talking about these efforts is but one step in the process of implementation. Precise and developed ways of talking about these actions is a crucial aspect towards the program's success and is developed through a collaborative and cohesive dialogue. And it is here that studies framing linguistic dynamics between time and space, they are applied to areas of study such as education, legal subjectivities, and political subjectivities, but are not yet substantially deliberately applied to professional programs that call forth the language of success. A chronotope or communicative paradigm supporting a linguistic, cultural, and legal leadership program would bring each interaction through communication of empowerment, integrity, and progress to advance the development of FANA's community initiatives. Here, productive developments are driven forward through solidarity, cooperation, and that has to occur in a web of interconnection. Here, the actor network theory treats everything in our social and natural worlds as interconnected aspects of a whole that influence one another in complex ways. An important aspect of this program lies in levels of mentorship that can guide future community activities around specific areas of study. Mentorship that instills leadership characteristics is a key to advancing community engagement and growth. And with foundations of linguistic revitalization, culture-based education, and legal awareness, the program can potentially transmit the knowledge required to perpetuate the FANA community's integrity and to socialize future generations with global perspectives. Educational pursuits that bridge the youth and older generations are key for sustainable self-determination and development within culture-based education. These connections themselves must be flexible to reflect the complexities of our contemporary world while simultaneously foregrounding traditional worldviews. There are a variety of approaches towards effective educational frameworks. A more generalized approach that can be filtered through community contexts would be an effective model for this program to follow. It is here that Drs. Cajete and Pueblo elucidate an effective framework that can be adapted when they write that, quote, indigenous educational cultural studies combine an evolving and integrative theory and a practice to affirm and demonstrate indigenous pedagogy through 5 key elements. These elements entail the creation of a new language to approach educational environments with, by transcending Western academic boundaries and decentering the historic contemporary consciousness and assimilative power of colonial authorities, and by rewriting the institutional and discursive story of indigenous peoples, and by applying the essence of democracy as an active political principle for reasserting indigenous rights, self-determination, and economic viability, end quote. It is here that this is in line with what Vine Deloria Jr. said, where this program can potentially provide a means of allowing human energies and understandings to converge and come together to form a more sensible picture of human life. To properly engage linguistic revitalization initiatives, the program would strategically approach linguistic revitalization efforts through a phase-by-phase method. These phases would focus on what the goal of the specific community is, whether that is to increase conversational skills, develop specific frames to understand legal concepts, or to establish an arena just for general linguistic exposure, for example. Supporting this flexible approach, targeted confidential assessments would focus on particulars of the language. And it is here that Dr. O'Grady describes these assessments as which, quote, performed on an individual focused component of language, such as specific vocabulary items, selected phonological contrasts, or that the differences in sounds produced and the meanings constructed because particular morphosyntactic patterns, which is the interplay between word forms and sentence structures. End quote. So these targeted competential assessments, mixed with other methods, such as accelerated second language acquisition produced by Arapaho scholar Dr. Greenwood, my advisor, can provide an avenue for student and teacher training workshops to be both a fun and effective environment to transmit both language and culture through. In this program, individuals with various levels of linguistic exposure may be accommodated to produce practical results. For example, these targeted competential assessments can be focused at first on language essential to progress various endeavors like ceremonial speech, oral histories, or traditions. Moving towards a more broad scope, a focus on holistic methods as a method for language acquisition and revitalization would incorporate general uses of language. And more specifically, these are characterized by a focus on overall communicability rather than mastery of any particular component of the language. Focusing on communicative ability can be more interwoven with other aspects of cultural education to provide an avenue for program participants to engage their environment in more ecologically connected ways. And it is here that there is a bridge between linguistic education processes and culturally based education. Otherwise, traditional ecological knowledge in some frames, Dr. Finn explains that traditional ecological knowledge, quote, is a term relatively new to Western science that encompasses a subset of traditional knowledge maintained in indigenous nations about the relationships between the people and their natural environments, end quote. The Linguistic, Cultural, and Legal Leadership Program proposes to provide an environment to reinvigorate relationships between the Fana community and their practical knowledge of natural environments that as a byproduct will promote social cohesion. This would-be 5-week program seeks to instill leadership qualities and the knowledge to develop actionable worldviews that are in service of the Fana community. With potential access to legal scholars and professionals, part of the program is on contemporary uses of internationally recognized standards for conduct. One of these standards flows through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as UNDRIP. And UNDRIP contains 46 articles that are recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and international human rights law. A program that strengthens cultural and linguistic nuances in concert with lessons on UNDRIP can provide the Fana community with assets to further develop and advance their community's well-being. Numerous aspects of law are of the highest importance to understand and exercise through one's life. For example, the connection between heritage and intellectual property law can serve as a great workshop to highlight the importance of legal protections on cultural expression. To provide more accessibility to develop in these ways, this program proposes to generate an environment that can raise awareness around these legal and cultural spheres, and is proposed to operate workshops, a short conference panel, and a cultural event. What is more, the program proposes to provide a nexus point to advance community conversations around the topics of language, culture, and legal knowledge. In innovative ways, these ways of communication may also serve as measures of evaluation to calculate the program's success. As a framework for effective summer program, this program proposes to gain insights from 9 characteristics that can advance the program's reach. These characteristics are proposed by Drs. Bell and Carrillo and include, quote, 1, an intentional focus on accelerating learning through a firm commitment to youth development and proactive approach to summer learning, with strong empowering leadership that is advanced by collaborative planning, providing extensive for staff development to be more effective overall, and through establishing strategic partnerships and a rigorous approach to evaluation and commitment to program improvement with a clear focus on sustainability and cost effectiveness, end quote. This framework has the potential to be internally evaluated through surveys, community response questionnaires, and post-program interviews. Externally, this program can gain insights from the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium, an accreditation institution that sets standards for specific educational conduct. The Higher Education Consortium was established in August 2002 at the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education in Alberta, Canada. Their aim is to bring professionals together to achieve common goals through the mechanisms of higher education. This program proposes to generate leadership and professionals to advance common goals, common educational goals that support social cohesion and community community development that is in line with Dr. McIver's point, where a decolonizational approach to education then brings a social justice aim to one's work, academically and personally. And it is here that this program would serve to use broad impacts and wide community engagement by creating a path for students to advance expertise on language, culture, and law. And there's a lot of importance in this because experts play a key role in determining what is relevant in a certain field of knowledge. In a way, expertise is a discourse, and according to Foucault, discourses do not simply reflect their objects of analysis, but in fact, they create them. And in the process, they position and license certain people to speak about things at the expense of others. In this way, the Linguistic, Cultural, and Legal Leadership Program proposes to encompass a central point that serves as a conduit to bridge even larger cultural projects. This program proposes to contribute to cultural reinvigoration and provide solid avenues for cultural and social mobility, such as interfacing with United Nations frameworks. Mobilizing action at these junctions of a community's social challenges and the United Nations is most effectively brought forth through the proper and effective dialogue. And it is here, head of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in April of 2024, there were some key questions to address in assessing how to effectively engage others while at the forum. These questions were informed through the theme for the 23rd session of this year, which focused on enhancing Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination in direct connection to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Sustainable Youth Development. With such a diverse potential for the application of these themes, a focus on how these topics are communicated and how they are strategized support the impetus for my inquiry here. And with that, moving from the broad importance of language in information dissemination, let's delve into its critical role in Indigenous language revitalization efforts. Individuals and organizations both interface with data through a variety of methods, and building on this understanding, a semiotic analysis that accounts for the symbolic qualities of UNDRIP can compelling avenues to contextualize information, which are crucial in strategies for a revitalization. A semiotic analysis involving an assessment of processes of meaning-making can reveal that UNDRIP itself can be viewed as a symbol of self-determination that indexes or signals specific ways of cultural continuity. For our purposes here, I will discuss an approach to meaning-making with regard to language revitalization, as the strategies and activities that promote must consider adequate paths to promote and shape languages viably. Levels of importance lie in the spatial and temporal or paradigmatic structures that support these processes. These elements reflect specific appeals to how contexts are created and in what manner these contexts may or are intended to interact with one another by those producing the contexts. In this way, the nation's decade of Indigenous languages can be considered through this paradigmatic lens that specifically seeks to advance how linguistic reclamation proceeds. Through this process, the decade of Indigenous language itself serves as a temporal frame that highlights the symbolic qualities that can have potentials to foster productivity with respect to advancing and shaping the viability of language revitalization. Exploring the concept of chronotope, which is the time and space manifestations, we can apply this framework to understand the interplay between time and space within the language revitalization efforts. In this light, such a paradigm can serve as an index or a signpost that highlights what specifically is important to talk about with respect to the development of coordinated conversation as they relate to all the measures taken for revitalization processes. And it is here that Mikhail Bakhtin posited that, quote, chronotopes are mutually inclusive. They coexist, they may be interwoven with, replace, or oppose one another, and they may contradict one another or find themselves in ever more complex interrelationships, end quote. Here we will find that time and space are not meaningfully isolated, they're not semiotically isolated, and are frames in which the discursive practices become operative. What that means is different qualifications of value interact with one another on a plethora of layers as the communication flows through these layers of a subject. It is important to consider that revitalization strategies vary depending on the unique circumstances of each community. Nonetheless, establishing a general framework can provide essential guidance for communities striving to preserve critical elements of their culture. The concept of this chronotopic paradigm, as advocated by the United Nations, underscores pivotal activities that can drive language revitalization efforts forward. At the forefront of these efforts lies a multifaceted initiative driven by the Permanent Forum, which has consistently advocated for both constitutional and legal recognition of indigenous languages. And according to the United Nations, these efforts include robust actions towards preservation, revitalization, and to secure adequate funding for these measures. As the forum calls for these levels of recognition, these central elements that fill out the paradigm are set into motion as these elements are described across the ADRIP and UNDRIP and the Universal Declarations on Human Rights. And in this way, actions that support the forum's call for constitutional and legal recognition of indigenous languages can be directly advanced through those mechanisms, such as these articles comprising UNDRIP provide a foundation and direction for communities to pursue their rights when these policies are incorporated into their respective political networks. Moreover, UNDRIP signifies much-needed developments in international legal norms and also reflects the UN's paradigm by signaling communicative strategies that underlie organization. UNDRIP contains various articles of drainage, such as Articles 13, 14, and 16. These articles provide a frame to channel nuanced community context through, and to this extent, the implementation of UNDRIP would reflect the performance of this paradigm for linguistic revitalization. However, before the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, I found that United Nations officials were promoting the performance of this paradigm through a number of avenues leading up to the event. A good example preceded this year's forum in March of 2024, when I attended a UN training for best practices while at the forum. The training session underscored effective communication strategies aligning with the UN's paradigm for language revitalization. The moderators of this training explained that the Permanent Forum is an advisory council, and it is also a place to make statements regarding the ways that UNDRIP is specifically implemented into a community. To be clear with these ideas in mind, one must be very strategic with their communication at the forum, as a basis of strategic participation lies in one's approaches to their expression. In alignment with this year's theme, the moderators first emphasized to participants to understand what the United Nations as an entity can do for people, seeing that the United Nations acts as a mechanism to advance initiatives. In this way, the UN can only aid a community in accordance with the specific ways that community clearly articulates what it is they need assistance with, such as the infrastructures connected to revitalization of languages. Thus, as a pretext to the forum itself, the training moderators expressed the importance of participating in their paradigm that is developed in part through UNDRIP. And my role as a representative of the SANDHILL band and FANA at the United Nations was to identify key aspects of communicative performance that inform paths and strategies for effective practices regarding language revitalization. One of these key aspects to generate awareness and appropriate paths forward at the forum this year is that performing this paradigm effectively manifests through, like I said, direct references to applications of UNDRIP and what that looks like in practice in one's community. They stress this time and time again. They just said we're going to be talking exactly through the mechanisms of the theme for this year's forum. For example, a good practice here can be noted through the establishment and or advancement of a tribe's educational committee, for example, whose task is to transmit language, culture, and tradition intergenerationally, as it is indicated in Article 13 of UNDRIP. Furthermore, the moderators also suggested developing awareness around other resources that also utilize UNDRIP, such as the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. The expert mechanism contains 7 members who are appointed by the Human Rights Council and are selected on the basis of competence and experience in the rights of indigenous peoples, with due consideration for experts of indigenous origin, as well as gender balance. The expert mechanism identifies some key elements that can hinder the realization of UNDRIP in the community. They identify these elements as, quote, UNDRIP is not readily accessible to large numbers of indigenous peoples for a multitude of reasons. These reasons include wide cultural and linguistic diversity, geographic factors such as remoteness and wide dispersion, as well as socio-political and educational marginalization that is paired with limited access to both telecommunications and other informational resources, end quote. Addressing these elements that can hinder UNDRIP's actualization in a community can be found through a clear and effective strategy for patterns of communication. These patterns themselves may rest upon symbolic interactions that can be informed through a focus on disaggregated data sets that would inform the actual application of UNDRIP in a community, what they would be saying to the expert mechanism, for example. Disaggregated data refers to each specific data point that contributes to the broad picture that the aggregated data is painting. And it is here that challenges of accessibility may be brought to task by the promotion of networks that support the integration of these specific aspects of more qualitative information and resources. In doing so, these interpretations of agency align with what Dr. Tennant explains, where, quote, the meanings of self-determination must not only be tailored to each country and region of the world, but they must also include the entire range of political arrangements, end quote, so they can provide opportunities for a community to engage UNDRIP in a culturally representative manner that can be expressed through these disaggregated data sets. So these accumulated points of information can shed light on distinct issues, such as a community's challenges and endeavors with their revitalization strategies. From another angle, a paradigm for linguistic initiatives can also readily signal that key ones to pay attention to specific and particular rights, as well as the effective ways to express the application of them in practice. So the difference between the de jure and the de facto orientation of the law. In this way, the expert mechanism maintains that it is necessary to develop these specific indicators for the distinct collective rights of indigenous peoples. For example, they say rights relating to lands and territories, cultures, languages, as well as traditional economic activities, such as placemaking as a strategy for social cohesion and community development. These indicators can be regarded as semiotic features of this paradigm as meaning is produced for specific and intended recipients. Here, the United Nations, other international agencies, states, and indigenous peoples are all actors in what is understood to be a process of mutual engagement. Part of mutual engagement with respect to linguistic initiatives entails establishing a reciprocally agreed upon procedure for pursuing revitalization measures. To this extent, the active construction of this paradigm is positively influenced by mutual interfaces and signposts that signal broader levels of value while grounding them in an individual's expression. It is here that Dr. Leonard points out that, quote, he knows that the field of linguistics, for example, is going to continue to study indigenous languages, and that therefore he wants to ensure that those interactions and associated interventions will happen in good ways, end quote. Assurance that these interactions and associated conducts happen in good ways can be more soundly developed through more transparent and beneficial mutual engagement. Because they talk about mutual engagement, they don't orient the actual mode of it going across, whether this is asymmetrical or relationary and mutually beneficial for people. Conversely, groups that establish negatively generalized perceptions of other peoples and disseminate those through their own communicative paradigms must be addressed to promote association from these mutually beneficial terms. It is here that Dr. Graymoring explains that, quote, governments in both Canada and the United States have worked to create an myth-like image of the political subjugation that they sought to exert over indigenous Americans, end quote. In one sense, for linguistic preservation and revitalization to maintain viability, these negatively oriented communicative paradigms that compromise other semiotic infrastructures or meaning-making infrastructures must be navigated through more developed scopes of dialogue. For effective measures to be taken, these levels of communication should adhere to common cause, example, language tuning for self-determination, cultural and linguistic retention, but they should also be channeled through the proper forums that can uphold or may uphold appeals to accountability. As such, in the globally networked world we inhabit, the common threads of dialogue should reflect pursuits in a much more ecologically minded fashion that seeks a common understanding rather than just trying to tell everybody else what their interpretation of something is. A chronotope or a communicative paradigm focused on linguistic initiatives can point to exactly what methods, plans, and programs will drive all of these processes involved. There are a variety of linguistic methods that can be adequately inserted into a program, and they can take on also many different paths to achieve proper implementation that operate on a variety of scales. So in concert with the United Nations Decade of Indigenous Languages, conversational methods that focus on visualization rather than memorization promote the acquisition of language in ways that can advance both critical assessments of all of the processes at hand. And that means the political, social, and cultural contexts of a situated community and the ways that they would engage with these language structures. So it is here that Dr. Grayhorning builds a house of language for his students that enables them to linguistic exposure that aligns them more closely as an emic or an inside learner when they work with his method, accelerated second language acquisition. Through the construction of these houses of language, individuals and their communities may assess the building materials necessary to foster viability, thus the critical assessment. In this way, the method accelerated second language can also be approached in clear and cohesive ways that identify the specific conditions that are needed within a community to promote continuity. These conditions themselves would be regarded as the semiotic features or the meaning-making features of the paradigm that the United Nations is talking about with respect to revitalization, and they can highlight each element specifically down to interactions and personal conversations that will yield the productive results of a method in a community. So bridging this conceptual approach to United Nations panel, accounting for these nuances is very important in connecting these initiatives with technology, for example. At the forum, panelists in the revitalization presentation pointed out algorithmic biases that are embedded in digital resources that are very reflective of an asymmetrical linguistic marketplace and just asymmetrical relations altogether. They indicated that just about half of these digital resources, for example, translators, digital keyboards, and other language interfaces, such as websites in general, they're informed through an English content language and have very little access to these disaggregated indigenous language data sets to use as training data, if there are any available in the first place. And these sorts of challenges identify key layers at play within the UN's paradigm. These key issues are namely a need for more community members to have more access, mobility, and participation in the processes of how these infrastructures are actually established and coded. So through a grassroots or bottom-up approach, a decentralized system of communication that promotes a critical analysis of the social, cultural, and political factors can address best practices to invigorate this UN's paradigm. This UN chronotope is multifaceted in its organizational and opens the space for a variety of interpretations and applications in communities. In line with this, Dr. Clegg maintains that hence, quote, the juxtaposition of organizational discretion and distributed powers will always entail heterodoxy and pluralism. That is, many organizational viewpoints and conversations rather than a singular monologue capable of representation as such, end quote. Another common thread to the UN's paradigm lies in the notion of coordination and dialogue between all of these institutions. Thus, there's the importance of the SANDHILL and FANA's participation at the forum and the wider chronotope, and it reflects the advancement of the dialogue that illuminates these pathways for cultural mobilization as we speak them into existence together. So these opportunities to mobilize perspectives on best practices serve to contribute towards the UN's paradigm from a basis of open discourse that promotes both an ebb and a flow of communication. So the social symbol that both the SANDHILL band and FANA promote, one of unification, one of empowerment, and the mobility of culture, it aligns with this paradigm and is developed in concert with those who are already interested and willing to incorporate meaningful dialogue into this communicative paradigm. And in this way, it is clear that the processes I am attempting to describe are effectively developed and exercised together. So moving forward, through annual events like the United Nations Permanent Forum and the Mishantika Placemaking Festival, these platforms for community organization can advance awareness around these topics as we strengthen pathways of interacting into existence with unity. Thank you.
So we are actually ahead of schedule right now. So we do have some time for some questions and comments. Does anyone in the audience have any feedback or questions for Kevin on the wealth of information you just shared?
What do you think the best practice would be to integrate what they're doing at the forum inside of FAN's overall structure and take advantage of what they're offering as far as support structure?
So, I was having a conversation with a gentleman from Apparel, and he was, their model, what they were doing, I think is a good practice, honestly, best practice to follow, because what they're doing is teaching people their own mechanisms and actually also creating their own softwares. So that way, when they go to the United Nations forums and talk about integrating technology with language, for example, they don't need to find like any sort of thing that's already made for purchase. They created it and brought this to the forum and said, how can we engage and interface with this on a professional level and have it be an internal process so that way they own the intellectual property rights of the code. Because coding is looked at as a recipe, still kind of in law, and the recipe can be safeguarded through intellectual property law. So that's why I say the best practice is to have as much of an internal communication and dialogue between people who have a diverse orientation to all of this. So you have the people creating the code, you have the people who are teaching the classes that in there, you have the people who are even teaching others how to interface with the technology itself too. So, and I would say that's one of the best practices, is to have as much internal creation as possible to bring forth to places.
Who knows?
I don't know what to say. I appreciate everything that you said you tried in terms of linguistics, in terms of how, but the problem that I'm having is we're doing it under the UN forum. The UN has never, yes, they have a problem with language and they seek to provide all the things that create better communication because of the multifaceted countries. The problem that I'm having with it is that where the intent of the UN was never designed to unite the people. So when I hear you speak about all the different types of ways for communication, to better communication, you did a fantastic job with that. But the intent of the elites that created that perspective is where I'm having the problem. And that's what the UN was designed to do personally, was to create a forum so that they could take advantage of the weakness of what these countries are using. Because of the fact that their language, their culture is over. So they try to create a union so that they can communicate. For what purpose? So that the elite can take advantage of that. So, yes, you did a fantastic job of explaining of what others have confirmed. And that was great. But the constant reference to the UN having a base to do it, where this individual is having a problem with. Because I felt you did a fantastic job, but that's where I feel the intent of the UN was basically designed to support the elites to take advantage of all countries. And they did a fantastic job of taking advantage. That's just a comment.
No, thank you. And that's where I actually, so I heard around the United Nations Forum just as an event in itself. I kind of think through all of it, the true best practices are to orient networks that are outside all of these things. Because then they actually have the robust communication, they're not relying on a place to go to have those conversations. So I agree.
My name is Anpan. I really appreciate you explaining all the UN detail pertaining to the youth. But the whole thing, like I say, each indigenous tribe we need to create a own platform to present it to their youth and use that mechanism to present it to the UN not going to do anything. And we take you as a tribe to have your own policy and your own platform when you come coming in you to present it, you want other people to work with you. Because the unit were put in place on a humanitarian platform to live with all countries, where you get a social platform that is not meeting the needs of the population globally around the world. So we take individual nation and tribe to create their own platform and present it to people, so people can know much about tribes then. So that's very important what you just said, when we take tribes to make sure they have their own education platform pertaining to their own youth. There should be a youth platform that educates the tribe youth on their tribes. I would say Canada on that, because the Canadian took the tribe language and dismanaged it, and the tribe brought it back on the platform to be a curriculum in all their school, because they created their own school in Canada. So that's what a lot of the tribes will have to do. But thanks for your own work.
Any others, comments?
I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Silas and to yourself, Kevin, because what I learned today was I took speech for most of my life from kindergarten to 12th grade. So I did syllable words and stuff like that. And just representing myself in court, learning that most of the legal language is Latin, listening to Dr. Silas speak. If I had heard him before I went to court, it would have been so much easier. Because now I know if I'm talking to somebody that is not American speaking this language, I'm not gonna say, I was taught this. This is how I was instructed, right? So I'm gonna learn how to communicate, and I'm gonna make it my promise to try to learn at least 2 languages, because I truly did help Anna figure that, and it wasn't that difficult understanding the difference between 2 syllable words, 1 syllable word, a German word, and the French word. So it made a lot of sense, and then the stuff that you just explained about, it's all that we can not kind of like self-educate ourselves, because if we find out and you understand what's going on, you can implement this. I just got off the phone teaching somebody what Dr. Silas was telling me. She works for our legal housing authority. She's the property manager. They want me to come out. We have a lot of Latinos. We have people from Portugal. And it makes it so easy, because sometimes when you try to approach, and I was in a restaurant yesterday, and the lady was trying to speak Latin that she wanted to order 2 number 1s. 2 pancakes, 2 bacon, 2 eggs. And the lady that was talking to her in 1 syllable words, right? So now, I'm telling you, that thing is sticking in my head. I'm going home and it's just gonna be a global conglomerate. And I know the syllables, so, and instead of using small words or the words. So that's what I learned, and I think it's amazing, and I applaud both. And Kevin, you did great. You had no reason to be nervous. God bless you.
I am really glad that they're resonating, because we do value our immigrants so much that we think that we need to quote unquote dumb things down, so to speak. So I appreciate that, Zachary. To you, thank you for this presentation. You know, this idea of using chronotopes, which is sort of primarily used in literature and discourse, now mapping it to language acquisition. I find that really fascinating, and I'm wondering if you can provide just a little bit more information on the sort of tasks, the actual sort of maybe curriculum that they're trying to use for this accelerated language acquisition process using the chronotope framework.
Yeah, so within the classroom, the way that I was exposed, or I guess introduced to the method, was a visual. So it's all pictures oriented, and he was directing, Dr. Raymond is directing you with how to associate to that. And I would say it's almost a visual chronotope, because what somebody is looking at, perceiving, they are, because of these cultural factors. The chronotope in and of itself will be to integrate specific community perceptions to it. So you have to account for like psychological things, but also just, like the community's context as they relate to heritage and through art, because the and you just look at the pictures, and then you get the language through it. So it's more of a conversation when you're sitting down. What is this over here? And then the word, he wasn't even correcting like the phonological side. If somebody like misinterpreted it or mispronounced, he kind of let them work that through with the orientation to the picture. So I think the chronotope in that sense is a lot more of a visual symbol interaction than the actual conversation in and of itself. Because he wasn't really correcting people. It's just how do you perceive that? And this is what we're gonna have a conversation about.
Yeah, just for context here, when I was showing that, continuum of like linguistics on one side and then sort of going over to the other side of more like relational, this is sort of somewhere in between. We're hyper-focusing on, did you get every syllable correct? Did you spell it correctly? Is it 2 L's or 1 L? Is it GH or TX? You know, things like that, that you're allowing people to make associations based on their cultural values. So what you're hearing here is in that continuum. And we try to stay away from like spectrums and rigid lines, but it's actually sort of all related that way.
Yeah, and if I may add more with regard to the chronotope, so how I'm accessing the chronotope is through the semiotics, the study of sign, symbols, and meaning. And I like to follow the Persian tradition of that, which is the triadic, three-sided system, which looks at what is the symbol, how is it existing right in front of you, what is the meaning that thing is signaling, but more importantly, who is the person doing the interpreting? And those systems added into the chronotopes, I think, account for a lot more of the relational strategy, because it's not trying to be prescriptive, it's allowing people to be a lot more descriptive with how they're trying to learn and go forward. So, yeah. So I say it's the chronotope is like the door to get in, and then you would look at that triadic system of signs and symbolic interaction as the actual features of the chronotope itself. So yeah, and then the visual, I like to think about the visual aspect, pictures and all that, so it's good.
We'll take one last comment as we're coming close to the time to start our